Does the term transgenic edible vaccine sound far-fetched? Well, it's not. We're funding it. In fact, scientists from the University of California, Riverside, funded with your taxpayer dollars, have been studying whether they can turn edible plants, such as lettuce and spinach, into mRNA vaccine factories.
Hey guys, welcome back to UNASA TV. So today I want to talk about a new, dare I call it, infectious GMO tomato that's being introduced to backyard gardens. But before I get into that, real quick, I wanted to mention you guys asked, and we've been slowly moving forward with it on the UNASA Trading Company website. But we now have Bison wool products made in the USA. Everybody wants made in the USA stuff. They want stuff that supports farmers. Products like these, Bison wool, the wool comes from bison ranches across the United States, and it's processed up in Canada and then brought back to the US to be woven. So there's only one step, and that's because there's only one machine that can do it. But these are made in the USA, harvested in the USA. The great thing about bison wool is it's not just a winter thing anymore. You can wear it year round. These are athletic socks. They're called the BOSS sock, best overall short sock. I love the way they come up with names for this stuff. Good job, Ron and T. Anyway, so we've got some of these socks on our website. We also have the Pro Gear Crew socks, the Kanai boot socks, which are awesome socks. I don't have them here because I've been wearing them. The Kanai boot socks kind of have a green top, but I wear them in my boots all the time. The good thing about these socks this time of year is your feet get wet, they get sweaty, they get nasty, and the bison wool naturally helps to diffuse smells. So when you take your shoes off, they're not stinky. For that reason, they also have shoe inserts that you can put in at the bottom of your shoes. And I actually put these in the bottom of things like my Sperry's that I often just throw on barefoot. I know, gross. But at least these kind of help with the odor a little bit. And they also help with overall comfort. Bison wool is just such an amazing fiber. I don't know what else I could possibly say about it. But check out UNASA Trading Company, our website, and you'll be able to find all sorts of bison wool products, including beanies and things that you've seen us wear over the wintertime. Okay, so let's jump into this tomato, because a lot of people have concerns over genetic modification, and in general, there's a big concern now about vaccines being grown in our foods. And as I get into this video, you're going to understand that vaccines in food are actually not a new thing. They've been growing vaccines in plants since the early 1990s. It was conceptualized in 1989. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what plants they have used for vaccines already. And, you know, just with this whole transgenic vegetable movement, you know, what are the implications that we should be concerned with? Because are there implications we should be concerned with? This purple tomato, which was developed by Norfolk, is the first product, GMO product, that has been developed for consumers. And some people are calling it the Trojan Horse. And the reason is because they developed this tomato that supposedly has all of these health benefits. Now, you should keep in mind that none of these health benefits have been approved by the FDA. In fact, the FDA, basically what they did with this particular tomato was they just gave them a no questions letter response and said, go for it, put it on the US market. In fact, the USDA did the same thing. They just kind of said, well, you know, we don't believe that this is going to, you know, cause problems within, you know, crossbreeding or anything, so we're just going to put it on the market. All of that was based upon internal research from the developer of the tomato. Our agencies did nothing in regards to actually approving it, deciding whether or not these modifications could have long-term problems for those who consume it. None of that has ever really been studied. So it's a rather interesting case, but they're hoping that this genetically modified purple tomato, which is being available to consumers to grow in their own gardens. You can buy the seeds. I think it's like 10 seeds for 25 bucks. You can grow these tomatoes in your own garden, and they're hoping that the added health benefits of the antioxidants in the tomatoes, is like eating a batch of blueberries, will help people shed a positive light on the concept of genetically modified foods. So transgenic foods and GMO foods, what makes them unique in their own right is that they cannot possibly have happened in nature. It's not something that could have naturally occurred. So you've always seen different varieties, heirloom varieties, different types of varieties that have, over the years, they have cross-pollinated with certain species, or they have used natural selection to cultivate in order to create the perfect tomato, the perfect orange, the perfect whatever it is. A lot of these foods have been artificially selected by mankind, but even then, that selection could happen within nature under the right conditions. We're just controlling those conditions to create the plants that we want. When you get into genetic modification, what that means is that we're actually taking the genetic sequence from a plant species that could possibly cross with the other plant species, and we're figuring out a way to insert that genetic species into this plant to create an all-new plant that nature could have never created in and of itself. And there's a lot of concern with GMOs, number one, whether or not when we consume them, that change whether or not our bodies can actually consume it the way that it's being advertised to us. Because we've all learned over the years that with stuff like vitamins and things like that, when we take them, if it's not in the original food source, if it's not a raw food, our bodies just don't process it the same. We don't process processed foods the same as we do raw foods. So there's always those concerns. My concern personally, something that I have been deeply concerned about, is the concept of these genetically modified plants being able to cross-pollinate and spread those new gene sequences that aren't natural in our environment to other plants. And over time, you could literally change the entire ecosystem, because then those plants are going to cross-pollinate with other plants and we spread. And my question is, are we eventually going to spread something that becomes toxic? Okay, so vaccines are a perfect example, because vaccines are designed to make our bodies respond with antibodies to a deadly virus, okay? So in many vaccine cases, what they're actually doing is putting small amounts of that disease into your bloodstream. I know that's not how all vaccines work. They're all different. But if we start growing these vaccines within plants, and they've been doing this, right now they're trying to increase the dosage. So if one person ate one lettuce plant, they'd be fully vaccinated. But what's to keep those plants, and once you start this natural growing environment, what's to keep them from increasing the potency of that vaccine to the point where it could create possibly a new disease? That disease is then cross-pollinating from plants to humans. I mean, this type of science could go very wrong very fast. It reminds me of artificial intelligence, a type of science that many people didn't think was possible, and then within a very short period of time, it took off, it grew. The next thing we know, we have artificial intelligence teaching our kids very interesting things about history. So I think that there should be some deep concerns about these possibilities. I was watching an interview with Congressman Massie and the shepherdess. It was a fascinating interview, and he shared some of these concerns about the cross-pollination, the cross-contamination.
By the way, in the Ag Approach bill, I tried to defund research for transgenic edible plant vaccines. I know that's a mouthful and it sounds kind of scary, but it is scary. We are actually funding with taxpayer dollars research on vaccines to be grown in lettuce and spinach so that when people eat their lettuce and spinach, they will get vaccinated with whatever vaccine that plant is producing. I think we should know what's in our food. I don't think we need to be playing God with our spinach. And if somebody wants to do that, there probably needs to be tighter rules on it because pollen can escape and pollute seeds from neighboring farms or pollute plants in neighboring farms who never intended to be growing vaccines in their food. So I tried to put some rules on that in the Ag Appropriations bill, and I was able to stop taxpayer dollar spending in that Ag Appropriations bill, but they threw that bill in the trash and did an omnibus instead and didn't include the limitation on transgenic and edible plant vaccine research. So guess what? Now you got another year of transgenic edible plant vaccine research.
That's gonna be a post of its own there. That's very, very interesting.
And I remembered in another interview, he had actually talked to, I think it was an address to Congress, he'd actually talked about how they had put vaccines into corn, and when they came back and replanted with soybeans that were slated for human consumption, the vaccines had somehow contaminated the new soybean plants. They had to completely destroy the crop.
Well, my colleague on the other side of the aisle talks about keeping prices low. I think there's more to it than that for the American people. And he also speaks as if these vaccines, these transgenic edible plant vaccines, are only used for livestock. Well, in fact, they have been used for livestock. I'll get to that in a second. But they're also being used for people. That is the intended outcome of many of these programs that we are funding with money from the USDA. What could possibly go wrong with this research? Well, we found out a few years ago when a biotech company was experimenting, growing in corn a vaccine to keep pigs from getting diarrhea. What happened? Well, the next year where the corn was grown, the prior year, the corn came up. And it got commingled with soybeans that were being grown there. It contaminated 500 bushels of soybeans, which were then commingled with 500,000 bushels of soybeans. And those all had to be recalled and destroyed. Luckily, they caught it. Do we want humans eating vaccines that were grown in corn meant to stop pigs from getting diarrhea? I don't think we want that to happen. Yet that almost happened, and it could happen. There's another case where the pollen cross-contaminated another crop of corn, and 155 acres of corn had to be burned. What are the cases where we're not discovering this? I think it's dangerous to play God with our food. I think we need a safe food supply. And this is about food safety. Ultimately, the people in this country need to know what's in their food. And if we start contaminating the DNA of our food with DNA from other animals or viruses, the pollen could spread, and we don't know what could happen. And I would hope we've learned a lesson from the Wuhan lab that sometimes things escape. Sometimes things don't go as you plan.
But what's to keep that vaccine from ending up in our diets when we have wind, when we have pollinators, and what's to keep it from ending up in our honey? Right? Some of the things that we rely on, that we revere, could be getting contaminated with these things. I want to get into this a little bit because I think people they don't realize how real all of this is. Okay, so this is all coming off of government websites. The concept of vaccines in food originally developed in 1989. Like I said, the first vaccine was successfully developed in tobacco in 1990, so a year later. In 1992, Dr. Charles Artenson introduced the concept of transgenic plants as a production and delivery system for subunit vaccines. In 1998, a new era was opened in vaccine delivery when research supported by the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases have shown for the first time that an edible vaccine can safely generate significant immune responses in people. And they've actually vaccinated people with edible plants. According to then director of NIAID, edible vaccines offer exciting possibilities for significantly reducing the burden of diseases like hepatitis and diarrhea, particularly in the developing world where storing and administering vaccines are often major problems. So to date, genetically modified potatoes with vaccines have been tested and used on humans. Vaccine development has successfully tested a potato-based vaccine to combat the Norwalk virus, which is spread by contaminated food and water. Genetically modified tomatoes turn out to be a great resource for transgenic vaccines. They can put in anti-malaria vaccines, HIV antigens. They are talking about using tomatoes for a vaccine against Alzheimer's disease. They've even discussed using it for the rabies virus. Now, this is a little creepy. The banana is currently being considered as a potential vehicle for vaccines against serious as well as 2 common diseases. The advantage of bananas is that they can be eaten raw as compared to, potatoes and rice, which are used for vaccines, can't be eaten raw. They get cooked, and so they lose part of the vaccine potency. And children tend to like bananas. They're always coming for our children. Maize, corn, has also been used for a vector for various edible vaccines. The Egyptian scientists have genetically engineered the maize plants to produce a protein known as HBsAg, which elicits an immune response against the hepatitis B virus. Rice, I've already mentioned. Spinach is something you've heard a lot about in the news lately, and spinach is actually kind of an interesting one because it has been able to be used as a vehicle for vaccines in the past. The problem is you have to keep the spinach cold, right? And so now we have these mRNA vaccines, which recently developed new technology, but they believe that with messenger RNA or mRNA technology, they can create a product grown in the lettuce that doesn't have to be refrigerated, that's easier to get out to the consumer, and just a much simpler process than what they've done in the past. So what I think, the big talk, because obviously these things have been going on since the 90s, right? The reason why people are paying attention to it now is because for many years people didn't even pay attention to vaccines, and then they started paying attention to mRNA vaccines because they kind of hit the spotlight with COVID. Although the technology had been being developed long before COVID, they just kind of moved in that direction with that particular vaccine. And because of the development of that vaccine in such a short period of time, with the amount of government spending that went into it, they've now figured out, okay, well, we can actually grow this in plants, and it has a better shelf life than other, trials in the past. We don't have to cook the plants that it can go into, and we can send these vaccines out to the masses through regular food that they eat, right? Ideally, a single plant would produce enough mRNA to vaccinate a single person. So there's a lot of this spinach and research with mRNAs is being funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation. DNA containing the mRNA vaccines can be successfully delivered into the part of plant cells where it can replicate, demonstrating the plants can produce enough mRNA to rival a traditional shot, and finally determining the right dosage. Ideally, a single plant would produce enough mRNA to vaccinate a single person, according to Juan Giraldo, an associate professor in UC Riverside's Department of Botany and Plant Sciences. We are testing this approach with spinach and lettuce and have long-term goals of people growing it in their own gardens. So now we're trying to get people to self-medicate again. Farmers can eventually grow entire fields of it. A couple of questions that I've had with all of this stuff, besides the cross-pollination and just thinking about, we're putting these things that aren't naturally in plants to fight diseases that we can then get, and we're putting it out into our environment. We're allowing it to cross-pollinate, and as he said, replicate. These cells can replicate on their own, right? So we're putting all this out there. That's scary. That's a scary thought. Are we going to create our own apocalypse with these monster plants, these transgenic vaccinated plants? And then the other question that I often have is, what is the purpose of putting a vaccine in a food product? Most people who like vaccines, take vaccines, want to have vaccines, go to the doctor and get a needle shoved in their arm. Or, maybe put it in a pill or something so they can just swallow it. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's got to be a nefarious reason for putting it in salad. You know, are we trying to, and also keeping in mind that pollen and the cells can float throughout our entire environment, birds, whatever, can pick up these plants, drop them off somewhere else. This stuff could spread into our environment. People who choose not to be vaccinated could end up being vaccinated from their own garden, right? Without even realizing it. So there's that question. I recognize the fact that there are third world countries where it is hard to vaccinate a large majority of the population. I also recognize that in those third world countries, a large majority of that population doesn't even realize what they're being vaccinated with to begin with. The education programs just simply aren't there. So what do? We want them all vaccinated, right? So we feed them a salad that has this stuff grown into it, and then they become vaccinated. But what if we start treating our own people the same way we treat people in third world countries? What could we do with this technology if another, something breaks out, another pandemic, and people don't want to take the vaccine freely? Are we going to force it by putting it into our food supply? These are all questions that I'm concerned with. They're questions that I feel everybody else should be concerned with. And I don't understand the ethics behind what they're doing. I don't think it's safe for our ecosystem. I don't think it's safe for our freedoms. And, why, at what point do we get to the point of playing God where we feel that we can make these such advanced changes to these simple plants that were given to us? And they were perfect in their own creation. I don't know, guys, it's something to think about. It's a topic that I realize is controversial. And I do realize that there are some genetically modified plants that have done, marvelous things for society. But at what point, does it go too far? At what, and what, again, like why do we have to have edible vaccines grown in gardens? What is the point of that? Anyway, be sure to check out Yanasa Trading Co., or you could just use any of the links below the video to start surfing some of our awesome bison fiber socks. Support American businesses, support America's farmers. Keep it natural.